there, Bourbon Real Talk family. Randy Sullivan here with a very special edition to answer an age-old question, and that is, why do dusty bourbons taste different than their modern counterparts? Now, this may be a completely foreign subject for you. You may not even know what I'm talking about, but the word dusty has become popular in the whiskey enthusiast community. It's not a legal term, so everybody may have their own definition of what a dusty bourbon is, but we're gonna, put up some parameters for us today so that we know exactly what it is that we're talking about, and then we're gonna roll into it. So for me, a dusty bourbon is something that came from the glut era. And what that means is during the 60s, 70s, and 80s, bourbon had kind of fallen out of favor in the United States. There were a lot of people that were drinking clear spirits, vodkas, gins, things like that. And the bourbon producers, when you do your bourbon production schedule, you're guessing what your demand's gonna be in 6, 8, 10, 12 years. And they were wrong. They ended up with more bourbon than they had demand for. And that's what we would call the glut era. And that ended kind of towards the end of the 90s, rolling into the 2000s. The demand picked back up, so they were able to get rid of all that extra whiskey. But when I say dusty, that's what I'm talking about. Where does the term come from? Well, you can imagine it's actually about dust. So I was able to pick this bottle up. Many of the dusty bourbons are found on the back of a liquor store shelf, usually an old liquor store. They had something sitting there, it got pushed to the back, no one's seen it in years, or maybe you found it in your, uncle's closet when he passed away and you were cleaning out his effects, whatever. But typically it means it's been sitting there for a long time and it's collected dust on the top of it like this bean bottle. And people started referring to those as dusties and it just kind of became a thing. So if you're talking about why they taste different from their modern counterparts, probably the most common explanation and what makes the most sense is that back then, they were able to have a lot of age-stated products. So, like this wild turkey that's in this box is an 8-year age-stated wild turkey. Well, if you have bourbon that's sitting in the barrel and you don't have anybody to sell it to, and the easiest way to keep it in storage is just to keep it in the barrel, there were a lot of whiskeys that ended up aging for longer than their age statements would suggest based on what's on the label. And so you might have bought a bottle that said that it was an 8-year-old bourbon, but it could have had, 10, 12, 13, 14-year-old barrels that went into that batch. And so you're actually buying something that's much older, but they didn't want to change the age statements on the label because, one, it would kind of indicate that nobody wanted the old bourbon, and two, back in those days, back in the 80s, there weren't a lot of people that wanted a higher age stated bourbon. It wasn't until Pappy Van Winkle came along and made that kind of a popular concept. And honestly, I think probably the early converts were people that were used to seeing higher age statements on products that came from other countries like Scotland, where things age slower. And so back then they wouldn't have wanted to do that, but they were also afraid that if they changed their age statements, that they wouldn't be able to keep it up in the future if demand picked back up. So there's a lot of dusty bourbon that says that it's one age, but it's actually a lot older. Now, when you look at what's changed in the manufacturing process, almost everything is different. So, grains have changed a lot since the 60s and 70s when these, glut age whiskeys were originally being manufactured. We have genetically modified grains that are being used by most of the distilleries in modern times. Now, not all distilleries have switched to genetically modified grain. I know that an article I read said Buffalo Trace still uses all non-GMO products and so on and so forth. Jack Daniels at one point was using all non-GMO products. But there's been a lot of techniques that have been developed and strains that have been developed in the farming community to increase yield, to reduce the need for pesticides, to reduce the need for fertilization, and so on and so forth. And obviously, if you grow things different, the grain that goes into the whiskey, it can taste different. So they used different pesticides back then, they used different fertilization techniques. And so when you take all of that as a whole, the grain that they're using today is probably quite different than the grain that they were using back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s when this stuff was originally being manufactured. Another process change that's happened is there's two different ways for you to mill your grain. Well, there's actually more than two, but there's two common ways for you to mill your grain when you're making whiskey. And one is called a roller mill. And a roller mill is pretty easy to imagine. Imagine two gears, but instead of gears, it's a roll, and they have teeth that line up with one another. And a roller mill basically passes the grain between these two rollers, and they can adjust the width between the rollers so that there's just enough space for the grain to get in there and get crushed. And that's typically a process that's used in Scotland. But most of the bourbon manufacturers nowadays are using what's called a hammer mill, and the best way to describe that is kind of like if you've ever looked down inside your garbage disposal, there's those things that spin around. So the whole thing spins, but there's other things that spin. That's kind of how a hammer mill works. And hammer mill produces generally a much finer product after the grain's been milled and passed through it. And that has a huge impact on the surface area of the grain that's being touched by the water during the cooking and fermentation process. And so there's some theory out there that back during the glut era that roller mills were more popular, but because of the lower operating cost of the hammer mill, that most of the distilleries have switched over to a hammer mill, and that could have an impact on the way that the whiskey tastes to us today because of the increased surface area, greater level of water penetration and extraction during the cook to convert all those sugars and get everything out of that grain that they need for the fermentation process. So that could be another possible issue. Another change that's taken place is there's been a shift more towards commercially produced yeast. So yeast eat up the sugar that are in the fermentation process, and they produce CO2 and they produce alcohol and other compounds that all affect the flavor of the whiskey. And what yeast you use does have an impact on how the whiskey tastes. Well, yeast is a very delicate, it's so easy for it to be infected by other things, for it to mutate, for it to change. Even a change of environment can cause the yeast to mutate and change. And quite honestly, they didn't have all of the modern techniques that we have today to keep those infiltrations and mutations from taking place in their yeast strain. And because there are modern techniques that are more easily employed by commercial laboratories that are set up to do just that, lots of modern distilleries have stopped trying to maintain their own proprietary yeast, and they are now pitching dry yeast that they're purchasing from these yeast manufacturing facilities that specialize in that. And so there was probably a whole lot more variability back in the glut era of the yeast that were being used. It was probably much more likely that there was some sort of infiltration of a bacteria or a wild yeast or ambient yeast that could get in there, and all of those things could affect the flavors. There's also been a lot of changes to water since the glut era. So it's kind of interesting. In the United States, I think we're the only major developed country that promotes drinking of purified water. And there's some science that's coming out now that says that if you take all of the minerals and things out of the water and you drink it, that it can actually pull minerals out of your body. And so, water's changed quite a bit. Water purification has changed quite a bit. The technology that they can have on site at a distillery, the reverse osmosis and the bacteria killing technology and things, it just didn't exist back then. And one of the dirty little secrets of Kentucky is if you go on any Kentucky tour, they're going to tell you how special their bourbon is because they have limestone filtered water. There's a limestone shelf and it filters the water, and it adds everything that we need to keep the yeast happy and blah, blah, blah. But every major distillery in Kentucky is currently using city water in their distillation process. And that city water is being purified, and it's pulling out most, if not all, of those elements that could be adding flavor to the fermentation process. And so I'm guessing that back during the glut era, that there were more distilleries that were actually using limestone shelf filtered water as opposed to today where they're all on city water, and that could have a pretty big impact on the way that the whiskey tastes. Now, while I was doing the research for this, I came across a theory that I had never heard before. And that theory had to do with making the yeast happy in the fermentation process. So it is a nearly universal practice that when you are starting your fermentation and you pitch your yeast, you put in some nutrients into the fermentation that are going to make the yeast happy, and I think they try to control the pH and all of this stuff, and all of that's normal and great. But nowadays, we know more about the chemical compounds that we're adding to the fermentation, but back then they didn't. And really what they were looking for was nitrogen. And the easiest way to put nitrogen in your fermentation was to dump fertilizer in it, right? Like actual fertilizer. That you would use for crops. And there were other compounds potentially that were in this fertilizer that could have ended up having a flavor impact on the whiskey, could have created secondary chemical reactions even in the bottle. And this practice was stopped in the late 1980s because we became aware of a compound that was being found in distilled spirits that was carcinogenic and had been shown to potentially increase the risk of cancer in humans. That test was never done, but it was done in lab mice. And that compound is called ethyl carbamate. It's also referred to as urethane. And back in the glut era, they weren't worried about how much urethane was in the whiskey at all. And so I wondered whether or not this fertilizer could have had an impact on the yeast that we're not getting today with modern nutrient techniques. I wonder if there were other compounds in there that could have influenced that. When I researched the ethyl carbamate, generally referred to as just EC or urethane, it said that it didn't really have a flavor. And so I don't think it's the EC itself that's having the impact, but it is possible that there are other secondary chemical reactions that are taking place because of that fertilizer or the existence of the EC inside the bottle that over time, maybe they take a long time to take place, and that's why over time the bottles start to have a different flavor. That is entirely possible. The next thing is that if you've ever gone to, and I forget which distillery it was, there's still a major distillery that uses them, but all the distilleries used to use cypress wood fermentation tanks. And I want to say it's Maker's Mark, but I'm not 100% sure. But almost all the distilleries have converted over to stainless steel fermentation tanks, which is interesting. If you take a look at a cypress fermentation tank that's been in operation for a very long time, it looks like you could catch Ebola from touching it. I mean, it's just, it looks broken down. There's clearly things that are biological things that are going on inside this wood that would most certainly affect the flavor of the whiskey that comes out. And I think it was in the late 1980s where Wild Turkey switched their final cypress tank over to a stainless steel tank. So during that era is where everybody was getting switched over, and that too could have a pretty big impact on the flavor of the whiskey. Distillation techniques have changed quite a bit. You know, the science of chemical engineering in association with distillation has grown leaps and bounds over the last 20, 30, 40 years. And up until that point, it was more about the tradition of distilling. But as distilling became more commercialized and through the glut era, there were a lot of mergers and acquisitions, and the production of whiskey was shrunk to a smaller and smaller number of facilities that were trying to maximize efficiency so that they could get profitability back up. And I wonder whether or not some of the modern distillation techniques that were designed specifically to increase efficiency and profitability haven't affected what compounds end up in the distillate that are later going to chemically react in the barrel and possibly in the bottle to change the flavor of that whiskey. I've been to distilleries that talk about having a slower distillation process because they're specifically interested in targeting certain compounds to get the flavor that they're looking for in their whiskey. And while I'm not a chemical engineer and I don't understand that, I'm certain that modern efficiency techniques have caused different things to end up in the spirit and therefore could affect its flavor. Another big thing that could be impacting the whiskey is the wood that goes into our barrels. So, you know, in the United States, as we have grown, we have had to start to plant forests specifically for harvesting to create a sustainable situation. But back during the glut era, there was still a lot of what they would call slow growth forest that were being made into barrels. The difference being the current wood that's being used to make barrels was those trees were grown specifically to be turned into barrels, and they are growing faster than their older counterparts because we found strains that grow faster. And when the wood grows faster, it's probably because the cellular size is larger. But when you dry that wood out so that you can make it into a barrel, the wood is not as dense. And I would also have to assume that the density of the flavor compounds that come out of the barrel is also different as a result. And so, the slow growth wood versus the quick growth wood could have an impact on the whiskey. Another major manufacturing technique for barrels has been how they dry the wood out before they make it into a barrel. In times past, most of the wood, if not all of the wood for the major manufacturers, would have been air dried. And I don't know if you remember a few years ago, there were a couple of releases of E.H. Taylor, and they called it like seasoned wood, and they air dried the wood for, longer than they normally do and all of that stuff. Well, that used to be standard operating procedure. Now that bottle's worth tons and tons of money because it's different from its modern counterpart. But that would have been just normal for a whiskey that was made during this glut era. And now all of that wood's being dried in a kiln, and it can be the time that it takes to dry it down to the percentage of moisture that they're looking for so that they can make that barrel has drastically shortened because of the use of commercial kilns. And so that is another factor that could be affecting things. Another thing that has changed over the years is barrel entry proof. So back in the 60s, the highest barrel entry proof you could go in at was 110, and then they changed it to 125. So if you know the legal definition of bourbon, you know that you can distill up to 160 proof. Most people distill around 135 to 145, and then they proof down, and most people go in the barrel at 125. Well, the reason why they do that is that's a more efficient technique. And later on, when that whiskey's done aging and they proof that whiskey that maybe got up to 130 or 132 proof back down to the bottling proof that they use for that particular line, say it's 90 proof, more of what's going into the bottle is something that they don't really have any cost in, and it's just reverse osmosis water because they're just proofing the whiskey down to where they want it to be. The problem with that is that a higher percentage of the product in the bottle that you're tasting never interacted with the barrel. So when you had lower barrel entry proofs and you didn't add as much distilled water at the end of the process, more of what went into your mouth interacted with that barrel, and barrel entry proofs have gone up over the years to increase efficiency since the glut era. So that could be another thing. Another difference is proofing water, and we've talked a little bit about the water and the limestone filtered water and all that stuff, but I'd have to assume that the water that they use to proof down is even more purified than it would have been back in the day before they had all of this modern technology. So it's likely that there were some minerals and other things that were making its way into that bottle that could have become a flavoring agent than it would be to happen today with all of our modern technology. Something else that's kind of an interesting thought is a lot of this glut whiskey got sold in decanters, like this guy right here. And, they're not glass, right? And they're also often painted with lead-based paint. And so there's been some theories that lead can leach through the decanter into the whiskey. There's some theories that the whiskey can interact more with the chemicals that are in the decanter, or potentially the decanter can allow slow interaction with oxygen and other things. So it might have also been a factor that they were putting so many of these things in decanters. I have personally found that the bottles that I opened that are old that have a cork seem to have a more extreme dusty-like characteristic to them than the bottles that I've opened that are screw top, like this guy. This guy is from 1978, my birth year, this benchmark, and it had a ton of fruit characteristics left in it. But a lot of the dusties that I have, you're not tasting a lot of that original fruit. Other sweeping changes that have taken place in the manufacturing, sanitation has changed quite a bit inside distilleries. And anytime that you have any sort of contamination, that's going to affect flavor. Maybe not to the positive, but it definitely make it different. And then something that struck me is if you've ever gone on a major distillery tour, especially a behind the scenes tour, and you see the kind of command center where they're watching the distillation and fermentation process come off, I mean, you would think that they were about to launch a rocket to space. I mean, the technology is so advanced, there's computer monitors everywhere, and I mean, you'd have to be a genius to even understand what any of that stuff meant. But from a 10,000 foot view, the introduction of computers into the manufacturing process at the level that they are today increases not only efficiency, but control and consistency. And so, you know, the overall distillation process used to have a little bit more variability and a little bit more human touch to it than the current manufacturing process does. And so I would have to assume that that would affect the overall flavor of the Dusty. Now, this part's kind of controversial, but most people will tell you that whiskey doesn't change in a bottle. And I just don't think that that is true. And the easiest way for us to wrap our heads around that is some of the times when you're looking at a Dusty auction online, it'll talk about neck fill. And what they're talking about is how full is that bottle up to the top compared to what we would have expected it to have been when it first rolled off the manufacturing line. And the reason why neck fill becomes a thing is because there's liquid that's evaporating out of the bottle. Well, if the liquid can get out, then the air can get in. And if you were to take Dusty whiskeys, especially any that have a low neck fill level, and you were to test their proof is lower than what it says on the bottle because alcohol tends to evaporate with time. And if the bottle's lost volume, it's probably lost alcohol faster than water, and therefore the proof goes down. So if the proof can go down in the whiskey, that means that that whiskey can interact with the air, and obviously a change of proof is going to affect the flavor of the whiskey. And I've even heard that, especially on like an 80 proof whiskey, if it has a drop in proof and bacteria gets pulled into the bottle, the bacteria can even grow in there because the alcohol content's not high enough to kill it. And that's why it might be dangerous to drink a Dusty whiskey that's really cloudy, because that could be an indication that there's some sort of a microbe that's growing in there that you don't want to put into your body. But, and my personal opinion is that the main reason why Dusty, and I'm talking old whiskeys, I'm not talking about like, well, they changed the label and they don't sell this anymore. I'm talking about whiskeys that are 30, 40, 50 years old. I think the reason why they taste so different is because whiskey does very slowly change inside the bottle because of oxidation. And that is a little bit of a controversial statement because it is such a widely held belief that whiskey doesn't change in the bottle. But the reason why I believe that the main component is oxidation is, one, there's a fortified wine called port that is oxidized. Madeira gets oxidized in its manufacturing process. And when you taste those things, there's actually a similar flavor that I get off of that I get in a Dusty bourbon. And it's like, well, why would there be this flavor that's similar when their manufacturing processes and their input materials are completely different? And I think that that flavor is oxidation. Now, that's just empirical. That's not scientific. But the other question is why is there a consistent Dusty old tasting flavor even across brands, right? So I can taste this old, musty, like leathery, wet forest floor kind of a flavor in this bottle of Benchmark, which was distilled at Stitzelweller, and this Wild Turkey, and this Jim Beam. And if you're getting a consistent flavor, even though those whiskeys obviously would have tasted completely different when they were first bottled, that tells me that whatever environment that those bottles were equally exposed to, which in this case was time, that thing is the thing that's affecting the flavor. And so, like it or not, don't get mad at me. My personal opinion, and I cannot prove this scientifically, is that the reason why dusty whiskey tastes different is because that much time in the bottle allows it to oxidize, and it gives it that old, dusty, musty, leathery flavor that some of us have grown to love so much. So I would love to hear your theories as to why dusty whiskey tastes different. You can throw them in the comments below. I try to reply to everybody, and I think that this could be a fun discussion for us to have. I've seen it come up many times in whiskey clubs. And if you want more information about Bourbon Real Talk, you can find that on bourbonrealtalk.com. You can find us on Facebook /Bourbon Real Talk and Instagram. You can find us on YouTube /Bourbon Real Talk. And you can subscribe to us on your favorite podcast player. So if you would subscribe, like, review, and comment on both the video platform of YouTube and your podcast player, that's going to help the algorithm show more people this content. And that's what we want to do. We want to get this word out. And as always, if you woke up this morning and you were unsure whether or not anyone loved you, just know that I love you. And I'll see you next time on Bourbon Real Talk. This content is being brought to you by the Bourbon Real Talk American Whiskey Aroma Kit. This is a tool that I put together to help all you whiskey aficionados out there develop your palates. You can sit down with the vials and train your senses, or you can sit down with a great dram and break that whiskey down to its components. If you have any interest of purchasing a kit of your own, head on over to bourbonrealtalk.com /shop and pick one up. Thank you for listening.